Hello, everyone. This is recording number 5 for Early Stoic Philosophy, a class on Stoic logic, physics, and ethics. And today I want to talk about convincingness. The Stoics distinguish between impressions that are convincing, those that are unconvincing, those that are convincing and unconvincing, and yet others that are neither convincing nor unconvincing. And that distinction, that fourfold distinction, is quite striking, in particular with respect to the third and the fourth option, that there are impressions that are both convincing and unconvincing and neither convincing nor unconvincing. The Greek term that is translated as convincing here, Pithanon, has been discussed by scholars in quite controversial ways, especially with respect to the question of whether we should think that it means something like psychologically convincing, that somehow we are kind of psychologically moved by something, or that it might mean something like rationally convincing, that in the light of considerations, we are convinced by something. And I want to talk about the Stoic proposal a little bit with respect to that distinction between psychological and rational convincingness, even though at the end of the recording, I will raise a question about that very distinction. Now, convincing impressions are defined by the Stoics as generating an even movement in the soul. And recall, the Stoics think of the soul as physiological, corporeal impressions and assent are movements of a corporeal mind. So, convincing impressions generate an even movement, presumably towards assent, and they have a certain obviousness. And an example is that while I'm talking, that I'm talking. So as I am talking, and I think the thought, I am talking, that thought, that impression has a certain obviousness. Now, we might think that talk about movements of the mind speaks in favor of the psychological reading, but we might also think that talk about obviousness is somehow epistemic or speaks in favor of the rational reading. However, one thing that should strike us as important is that convincing impressions are not defined by reference to truth. So the proposal is not that an impression is convincing if, for example, it is likely to be true, or if it seems to us that there are considerations in favor of its truth. And unconvincing impressions are ones that move us away from assent. So in both of these definitions, truth doesn't come up, and it may seem that that does speak against the rational reading, because the most straightforward version of a rational reading would somehow involve probably an appeal to the truth. Now, this term Pithanon, convincing, has been discussed most kind of intensely by scholars with respect to the way in which the academic skeptic Carneades uses it. Carneades is saying that the skeptics who suspend judgment, who do not assent to impressions or reject them, but rather suspend judgment on them, nevertheless can be guided by what is Pithanon, convincing. And here, that question of whether this is a psychological criterion or rational criterion has interested scholars specifically. And in that context, people have turned to Cicero's discussions of academic skepticism in his Academica. And there Cicero translates Pithanon as, in Latin, then Probabile. Now, this is one of the moments where translation kind of makes a philosophical difference, because the Latin Probabile, then in English Probable, kind of raises a flag. You can see here that the notion of convincingness that I'm discussing in this recording, as it were, stands at the beginning of a long tradition in epistemology, which eventually leads to what today is the discussion of probabilities in epistemology. And that is one of the reasons why it is such an interesting topic. Now, especially with a view to that, it is now important to see that the Stoics do not just offer a distinction between what is convincing and unconvincing, or a kind of scale of levels of convincingness, where something could be so and so convincing, have a certain degree of convincingness. That is not the proposal. Rather, you have convincing impressions, unconvincing ones. And then you have these two other categories. One of them, that an impression is both convincing and unconvincing, and the other, that it is neither. Now, let's think for a moment about these other two categories. An example for an impression that is both convincing and unconvincing is what the Stoics call an insoluble argument, an argument that cannot be resolved. And an example that the Stoics use here is the so-called liar paradox. In Cicero's description of how the Stoics think about this paradox, it goes as follows. You say, I'm lying, and you speak truly. And then the question is whether what you're saying, I'm lying, is true or false. And presumably, when we kind of look at that argument as a whole, we can put ourselves into two frames of mind. We can find it convincing or unconvincing. And that is how the Stoics describe impressions that are both convincing and unconvincing, that we kind of alternate, that the argument sometimes seems convincing and sometimes unconvincing. You kind of go back and forth. You waver between both. So here it might seem again that what the Stoics are saying is kind of psychological. It's kind of about a kind of wavering between two ways of looking at something. But it may also seem to have a rational dimension because, at least in the way in which Cicero describes it, our thinking about the liar paradox gets kind of hung up on the Stoic premise that an assertion, when you say, I am lying, is either true or false. And so you don't have the option to say, well, what you're saying, I'm lying, is true and false. So if you can't say that, then you get to the point where you find the argument as a whole convincing and unconvincing. At least that is the proposal. And then there are impressions that are neither convincing nor unconvincing. And the Stoic example is the number of stars is odd and the number of stars is even. And presumably what it means that this is neither convincing nor unconvincing is we are simply not moved one way or the other. We are not at all moved to either accept or reject one of these impressions. And again, that can be construed psychologically as sort of those impressions simply don't move us at all. But it could also be construed rationally because you could say, well, there simply is no consideration for or against assuming that the number of stars is odd or even. At least that is kind of stipulated by the way the Stoics use this example. So it seems kind of that we are stuck between these two options and we can't really resolve the question of whether convincingness is a psychological or a rational notion. And I want to leave you with the question of whether this discussion is maybe somehow fundamentally misguided. Because maybe you could argue that if you are a psychological monist and if you think, as the Stoics do, that the soul is reason, then what is psychological and what is rational somehow comes to the same. Or at any rate, that the distinction becomes blurred or not quite as clear as we might have thought at the outset. And I want to just sort of formulate this as a question to keep in mind as we will turn to the Stoic theory of the emotions and further themes relating to psychological monism, whether we can still make sense of distinctions like psychological versus rational if we are psychological monists.